Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on nuclear-powered data center, a sustainable solution for Southeast Asia's energy crunch, hosted by Nuclear Business Platform. My name is Zaf Quayler from Nuclear Business Platform, and I'm thrilled to lead this pivotal discussion on powering Southeast Asia's digital future sustainability. The Nuclear Business Platform has been established since 2012 and is playing a role in advancing nuclear energy globally. Based in Singapore, we have regional presence in Indonesia, India, Turkey, and Morocco. Ladies and gentlemen, Southeast Asia's data center market is booming, valued at 10 to 14 billion US dollars in 2025 and projected to reach 14 to 17 billion by 2030. But hyperscale data centers, each requiring 20 to 100 megawatts and shifting GPU-driven racks at 40 to 300 kilowatts, are pushing the regional IT load to 2,000 megawatts by 2029. With ASEAN's grids 80 to 90% fossil-based, Singapore's data centers consuming 7% of electricity and 82% of its ICT sector carbon emissions, the energy crunch threatens growth. Small module reactors, or SMRs, with their 90% capacity factor and compact footprint, offers a clean, reliable solution to meet these demands and align with ASEAN's net zero goals. Today, we'll provide actionable insights to move you from consideration to action, covering power purchase agreements, regulatory pathways, and practical steps for nuclear adoption. Our agenda includes two presentations followed by a panel discussion where participants can also pose questions. We are joined today by George Borovas, Head of Nuclear at Hunton, and also Gavin Kleinhans, Counsel at Microsoft Data Centers APAC. Ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned earlier, please feel free to use the Q&A function to type your questions, and we will hope to address your questions during the panel session later. So let's move on to our first speaker, George Borovas, Head of Nuclear at Hunton, a global law firm with deep expertise in nuclear and energy projects. George's extensive experience in regulatory frameworks and financing makes him an ideal to frame today's discussion. George, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zaf, and good afternoon, good morning to everybody. Delighted to be here with the Nuclear Business Platform, and very excited about having somebody like Gavin to discuss nuclear and data centers together. So let's dive right into this because there's a lot to cover. And thank you, Zaf, for setting up the issue and the framing the issue. So, I mean, if you look at the context, just to get right into the issue, it's like if you look at the Asian member states, they are increasingly actually relying on fossil fuels. And that's supported by the data. Of course, there's a big drive on renewables, but in the end of the day, the increase in consumption and electricity demands are enormous. And if you look at the data, you can see even that one of the biggest drivers for a new generation is coal. And so that's the reality that we're facing. And if you look at the data centers and the requirements that we're going to have for energy consumption that's going to come from the data centers, this is going to be a problem that's even going to become even more pronounced. Now, when you're looking at nuclear, it provides a general solution. It has emerged as a solution globally, as something that can work with renewables to achieve net zero, to decarbonize areas beyond electricity, that it's something that's reliable, resilient, and provides security of supply. It's affordable because of its long-term value and the fact that these assets can remain operational for decades, low land use, no storage infrastructure, things of that nature. And also there's a sustainable development and just transitions with respect to environmental issues. Now, this is not something that is out of context. In the past few years, for those who have been following this, we have seen a huge change in the perception, also in adoption of nuclear energy around the world, especially in the environmental world. And you look at the COPs starting from COP26 in Glasgow, where nuclear was actually shunned and was asked not to really be a participant. And you move forward to COP28 in the UAE, where nuclear started to become front and center as part of the climate change debate and a solution for net zero So that has something that was a tremendous shift in about a few years, and something that we're starting to see become commonplace now. Like after COP28, COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan also promoted the use of nuclear and highlighted the use of nuclear. So nuclear power now has become, again, one of the shining and rising stars. There's geopolitical issues that are developing with respect to nuclear besides the climate change. So there's, in general, we're seeing the pushing from deployment for the deployment at the highest levels of government for nuclear power around the world. Now, data centers, hyperscalers, we're starting to see also in the past 2 years an enormous shift to the studying, to the evaluating, and investment in nuclear from all the major companies, from Microsoft to Amazon to Google. You will see every other week there's going to be an announcement for a deal that one of these companies made with a nuclear technology company, an offtake agreement that they do from nuclear power plants in order to support the ambitious plans that they have to develop data centers and artificial intelligence around the world. I've been very impressed with the level of knowledge that has come from these companies, whereas a few years ago they had peripheral knowledge about nuclear power. Now they're starting to have a very, very deep understanding, and I think they're going to be a big part of the solution for the deployment of new nuclear. So what has happened? Why has it become so attractive? Why is it so attractive to the data center companies? It's mostly for the small modular reactors. And they're small. They're both in terms of power output and physical size than the existing large reactors that take longer to develop and to build. They're modular. They can be put in a series. They can be manufactured in factories and produced in portable and scalable as they are being constructed. And of course, they're small modular reactors, and they're fission reactions. They're using nuclear power in order to provide electricity and heat. Now, these designs, that most of them are still designs, they still haven't been constructed, but they have some general characteristics. They have these passive safety designs, which means is that you don't have to have human intervention in case there is a severe accident. By themselves, they will shut down one way or the other. They don't have a lot of moving equipment, so they have low maintenance requirements. They have a smaller emergency protection zone, which is important because you have the emergency protection zones in nuclear are areas around the nuclear power plant where you have enhanced protection for emergency situations. Because of these are smaller and safer in the way that they're designed, the EPZ around the nuclear power plant is much, much smaller. And they're compatible with hybrid energy systems. They can easily work together with renewables. They have flexibility in their deployment. They can be deployed in an island operation. They can be scalable due to their modularity. They can be sited in remote and small areas, and they can be constructed on time and on budgets due to factory production. So it's an easier construction project in a sense compared to the large reactors that take a much longer time. And they're also very long lifespan. I mean, these, as I said before, these reactors can operate for multiple decades, and that's something that's very unique about this, with very little refueling requirements. Fundamentally, in the end, they are carbon-free, they are reliable, they are dispatchable, and the most important thing that I always think about when it comes to nuclear is that they're energy dense. The resources, the fuel, the land that they need is very small in order to produce a tremendous amount of energy. So when you look at the energy, the issues for data centers, SMRs really provide a lot of the answers. So you have a high energy demand. You have a lot of designs between under 300 megawatts, which are scalable, and you have competition for other users. For instance, you can create island operations, remote siting, so you can site them in different areas. They are reliable. The costs and the construction time can be something that is that is easier to deal with as opposed to the large reactors. The timeline for commercial deployment of these depends, of course, on the various technologies, but they are within the next few years, and I think they're going to start becoming closer to deployment as the next few years happen and go go on and we start seeing deployment around the world with some of these first of a kind designs. But they are now at the time when we're going to start seeing these designs being constructed and operated. And of course, you have in the ESG considerations with all the data center companies that are looking to have a zero carbon use of energy sources. So you have a carbon-free source, small land use. And so there's a lot of the ESG considerations that are going to be important for the developers and the investors in these data centers. Now, we're starting to see, of course, that the data center companies are embracing the SMRs. They are looking to the future. And as I mentioned before, you see investment even technology companies and trying to talk about how you can work together with these SMRs. But I also don't want us to forget that the conventional large reactors have also become a part of the solution. For an example, Microsoft in the United States made a deal for a power purchase agreement with 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, which is a large existing reactor that was not operating, going to bring it back to life and to have a 20-year, I think it was, power purchase agreement with our large reactor. So I think that it doesn't have to be small modular reactors. As mentioned before, there's some reasons why SMRs work really well with data centers, but that does not preclude large reactors also being used to power small modular reactors, to power the data centers. So what happens now is like, okay, we have this. I see this a bit of as a race. There's many countries around the world that are talking about nuclear. Everywhere where I go, everybody's talking about data centers. We want to attract more data centers, and this is going to be a big kind of development for us. So how do you do that? I mean, how do you attract more data center companies, and how do you make sure that nuclear can be the backbone for that? And there's a lot of things that governments and societies can do in order to create a favorable environment for such deployment. And sometimes I've seen, having worked with a number of countries that are developing new nuclear programs, is that there is a focus on a part of the issues that need to be focused on, and maybe sometimes the focus on the wrong issues. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. So the key thing is to see how do these things work in the context of getting a financeable nuclear project, right? And most important, of course, is you want to understand where's the revenue going to come from. Just building something and having no plan on how the revenue, who's going to buy the power, for how much and for how long. That's going to be the most important thing that you have to figure out. Surprisingly, sometimes this is not something that a lot of governments focus on upfront. And what they do sometimes is that they focus on technology choices, which is a secondary issue that you have to think about. So certainty of revenue generation, the clarity and the role of government. Here we're talking about data centers, private companies. Sometimes we have developers of projects that are private, but there's no question that any nuclear deployment, whether it is within the context of a data center or just baseload generation, does require a significant involvement of government in terms of regulatory structures, but also support that the beginning of these programs require. The regulatory regime is super important to understand is how this is going to be regulated, how is it going to be licensed. When it comes to deployment with data centers, how do you co-locate something like that? What does that mean? Where's the nuclear site going to be? Who's going to have responsibility over the safety of the site? And things like that have to be worked out. And this is particularly important with these kinds of applications because we don't have a lot of experience with that. If you take, existing large reactors today, and there is a kind of standard regulatory system that you can look around the world, we can just say this is how you license for construction, you license the operations of a nuclear power plant. When you start looking at these types of applications with other industries, they're going to create some novel issues that need to be figured out. So having that regulatory regime that's sensible, that allows for investors to have a visibility about what the process is going to look like is really important. Reputational concerns, always an issue with nuclear, despite the wonderful environment we're in today where everybody seems to be very positive, but no matter what, it's a sensitive issue. It has questions. There are memories. People remember Fukushima, people remember Chernobyl, and they want to understand what happens with the safety. They want to understand what happens with the waste. What does it mean to have nuclear waste? And all the planning, what's going to happen at the end of these nuclear power plants? How are they going to be decommissioned? And so you want to have a plan for political support and also public support that's going to be across society and across parties. And that's also really important because sometimes we have seen in countries around the world where you have one political party in government that is really, really supportive of nuclear and has all these plans, and they do all kinds of things, and then they lose the election. Opposition comes into power and they say, well, we don't like nuclear, we're going to work on our renewables program, and they kind of slow down or shut down programs. So you need to have a uh, across the party kind of parties in society support for nuclear to be successful. And finally, well, the most important from a commercial point of view, project management, how these projects are going to be put together. As I mentioned before, there's always a big focus on which technology you're going to use, but the technology is not the problem usually. The problem with new nuclear construction is on the project management. How is it going to be constructed? Who has that experience in order to construct these power plants properly and on time and on budget? And how are you going to put together these kind of teams that's going to be required in order to make these this a reality? And this is where the support and the role of government is also very, very important. The involvement of banks in terms of financing as well is something you have to think up front. And this is the thing that you can spend a lot of time, should spend a lot of time in figuring up upfront. And I think that the data center companies are going to be a very important part of that. And I'll show you later on what I mean by that and how they can help with the risk of project management and the risk allocation. So you have to be looking at the full phase of a nuclear project in order to understand how it's going to be developed, how it's going to be financed. Early stage financing is really, really difficult for private investors because it's too far, it's speculative, there are a lot of risks, there's no revenue. Until you actually have an operating nuclear power plant, there's no revenue. So it's a bit of a hard thing to convince investors to come in early on. And you have the technology development, which of course happens around the world with the technology companies. But then you get into the issues of project development, as I mentioned before. How do you structure a project? Looking at preliminary licensing and procurement issues, site assessments, and then you get into the construction, the commissioning. And towards the end, you get into the power generation, which you can start talking about with the power purchase agreements in order to start dealing with the revenue. But until you have that power generation, all these steps before, there's no revenue coming in. So somebody has to be providing that revenue, and there's got to be a plan for who's going to do that and for what. So this is where you should see government action, to see how they can minimize this risk, how they can help with the investment that comes for these preliminary kind of stages, and to look at how government can support this until you reach at least the power generation phase. So far, we haven't had a nuclear power project that has been project financed, which means that it would come from the revenue of the project itself. Hopefully, at some point, we will get there, but it's going to require a lot of experience and a lot of successful projects done before, in series before maybe a project can be project finance, a nuclear project. But one thing that's also really nice that is recent development is we're starting to see the multilateral development banks, the MDBs, the international government type banks that are out there, including the World Bank, that have now started supporting nuclear. They're changing their policies. And we saw for our region here, the Asia Development Bank, there's been some announcement that they're going to be shifting their policy with respect to nuclear. So there's going to be a pool of investment that is possible out of these development banks, which is going to be very important to help with the funding gap that we see in these projects. So the other thing is to look at a project and understand the risk balancing, and as well as where do you need to have government support in order to structure properly a nuclear power project. And this is kind of like a typical nuclear power project kind of structure, where you have maybe a government shareholder, you have a vendor that's supporting with equity, and then you have an operator, an owner that is working on the development of the project. You have your fuel supply agreements, your O&M agreements, operations and maintenance, and then you have an EPC contract to support the construction. And then, of course, very importantly, you have the offtake agreement for the power purchase agreement that's going to be able to buy the power and provide the revenue back into the project. Also, you're going to have the involvement of the lenders and all this. So this is, this doesn't have to be like this, but this is a structure that you typically can look to as a new nuclear project. And the question is now, where would, in this structure, how you would see the role of government and the role of the hyperscalers. So government within this structure can take a lot of some risk. So you can have, as I said before, a government shareholder that's going to be providing equity. It can be providing a lending support. It can be providing government loan guarantees, the regulatory structure, of course, and how that's going to interact and help with all these contracts and all these projects. So the government definitely has different entry points in order to make sure that you minimize the risk for these projects. But the hyperscalers now are providing a very interesting dimension, which, as I mentioned before, can help with the structure to make these structures work and make them bankable. So the easy one is the one to the right, where you have the hyperscalers, where they're just going to be the off-taker through a power purchase mechanism. And which means is that once the power is being produced by the nuclear power plant, the data center company will buy the power at a certain price for a certain amount of period, and there's a stability in revenue generation. You can look forward and just say, okay, once we start having a operating nuclear power plant, I know what the revenue is going to be like for a long time. Based on that, you can help with the financing. You can go to the banks, you can explain to them, here's the project, here's the structure, here's where the revenue is going to come from. It's going to start from year 2031, and we're going to be selling our power at this level, at this time, for this long. All that helps with the financing and the structuring. Would that be just enough at this point? Probably not. And the reason for that is that these projects are first of a kind for most of these technologies. So if you have somebody comes in and just says, well, want to invest in a project, and you say, well, this is going to be the first one of these that we're going to build, and you only can rely on the fact that power is going to be sold at a specific price in the future when it's operable, I think that's the risk that a lot of companies would not take. So they want to see a little bit more risk sharing and risk taking on the construction side. And this is where potentially the data centers and the hyperscalers can be looked at for part of that risk sharing, where they would actually become part of the consortium that would put these projects together. And that could be in terms of support, it could be in terms of equity, different ways to de-risk the projects on the construction side. And mind you, when I say this, I understand, of course, is that, and like to hear from Gavin after when we have our discussion, that the companies, of course, this is not what they want to do, because this is not their business, right? Data centers are not in the business of producing electricity. They want to focus on their business, rightfully so. But for the first ones of these projects, if we're going to do a series of them, I think it would be important for them to have much more involvement in the actual development of the projects themselves, because that could be a way to de-risk them. And once you do that, the first one or the second one, for the third and the fourth and the nth one, you will no longer need a lot of that support, because you will have an established supply chain, established project structure. And at that point, people can go back to their original places and just say, okay, now I'm just going to be buying the power at a specific price, and just don't get me involved in the development. You guys know how to do this. But we're still not there yet, because a lot of the companies that have the nuclear technologies are that. They're just nuclear technology companies as opposed to nuclear project development companies. So this is where I think the biggest conversation needs to be had in order to have the structure of these companies, of these projects done. So how does the nuclear development companies, the nuclear technology companies, interact with the local government as well as with the hyperscalers in order to put together a real project structure that's going to be able to be financed? The other thing that's also super, super important, and this is important for everybody that's going to be involved, including the data center companies, but also the investors, that the lenders, is the issue of third-party nuclear liability. In case there is an accident, and it rarely happens, but from time to time it does happen, this is a risk that a lot of companies cannot take. We have, of course, treaties, we have legislation that provides for the exclusive liability of the operator. So you need to have a very clear law and system that says that there's not going to be anybody else that's going to be responsible. It has to be very clear about who is the operator, the operating company, and presumably hyperscalers would not want to have any role in the operation of a nuclear power plant because that exposes them to potential liability. But no matter what you do when you structure these projects, there's always going to be some residual liability. What happens if the law does not address a certain issue, cross-border issues for contamination, things of that nature that maybe are not necessarily addressed by the law. So you have to be thinking about what happens in case there's these gaps in liability. So addressing a very robust nuclear liability regime, adhering to the treaties that are available here, which is the Vienna Convention or the Convention on Supplementary Compensation and the Paris Convention, the major conventions around the world, I think is going to be very important in order to make sure that your investors are comfortable with this particular risk because it's very, very important. Finally, one thing that governments can look to is to understand the ecosystem that is required for any nuclear project, and most importantly, for a nuclear power program. You never ever construct a project and that's it. Nuclear is, of course, large infrastructure, and a lot of times, a lot of people tell me it's like, oh, it's no different than just a large construction site, and I always beg to differ because in order to have a successful nuclear program, you have to create a nuclear industry in your country. That's the only way this works. So you can have the nuclear technology, you can have the construction services, the nuclear construction services, which are particular, but you have to worry about fuel, raw materials, and other ancillary services. These are all components that any government that is interested in developing a nuclear program and to support its energy uses, its energy needs, as well as the data centers they want to attract, these are things that governments can support and invest in order to create this ecosystem that's going to be supporting these nuclear power plants. So just as a conclusion, one thing, as you see, that it takes a lot. And when you look at all these different countries here, none of them have nuclear power, right? So for each of the countries to develop its own ecosystem that I mentioned before, is going to take a lot to support the expansion of the data center capacity. One thing to consider, and it has been considered many times, it's not easy because it gets into issues of political issues and other issues, but regional cooperation might be something to think about because there could be parts of that ecosystem that I mentioned before that could be shared between the different countries. There are the Asian structures that support these kind of collaboration, and I think there could be something that don't necessarily have to have every country develop every part of that ecosystem. So there could be a part of that where you're going to collaborate, work together in order to reduce the risk and share the cost for these kind of development of the ecosystem. So that's that's my introductory remarks. One thing I just wanted to mention is that as we put these projects together in the region, it is very important to have a combination of understanding how to put together a nuclear project and also to work in the area in the countries themselves, because the global nuclear industry has some structures that have worked, but each country, each region also has its particular unique characteristics and issues. And having that capacity to understand nuclear, but also understand how things work in a particular context is very important from our perspective at Hunton, because we have a very strong Southeast Asia experience and a very strong nuclear group. With me being here in Tokyo, Southeast Asia is a place where we're very much focused on the development of new nuclear, and especially when it comes to the development and powering of data centers. So with that, I'll stop my remarks and open the floor now to Zaf, maybe, or Gavin, to talk a little bit more from the data center part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George, for that compelling overview. Your insights, especially potential regional cooperation among ASEAN countries, is indeed a very touching point. In fact, this point was also mentioned by Rafael Grossi when he was in Singapore last week, and he gave a lecture, and he was even citing the example of the CROSCO nuclear power plant, whereby power is being shared between Croatia and Slovenia, if I'm not wrong. So regional cooperation certainly is it's a very interesting perspective that ASEAN countries can consider. So now let's move on, and let's now hear from a Microsoft perspective. We are delighted to have Gavin Kleinhans, counsel from Microsoft Data Centers APAC. Gavin brings critical expertise in navigating the strategic energy needs of data centers across Asia Pacific. I shall now welcome Gavin to the floor to give his presentation. Gavin, please.
Thanks, Zaf. Thanks, George. That was a great overview of nuclear. And I have to say this from the points you raised, I'm definitely sold. It sounds fantastic, mate. So I'll just get up my slides. Just give me 2 seconds. And I'm hoping this works. Can you see them, Zaf?
Loading still.
Okay. Sorry. So everyone has mentioned, yeah, I'm at Microsoft at the moment, helping them develop their data centers within Asia Pac. I do think that there's some unique perspectives that we're seeing from the US that will come across to Asia. Hence, I think it's a great discussion point on nuclear and how it may be a solution here in Southeast Asia. But as George has mentioned, there are obstacles to overcome, i.e. the government and the regulations that go with it. So look, I'll just get straight into it. There's a bit to go through. Just quickly, I do cover all of the region in Asia Pac itself. So everything from Japan, South Korea to India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and of course, Australia. What I'm seeing is consistent themes across the region that come across through the data centers themselves. And obviously where George is coming from is a solution through the energy or the power component of data centers. What I'd like to do is take a step back and see what the overall key considerations for nuclear powered data centers are, but also the issues that I'm seeing come across within Asia itself. And I think that there is a unique perspective that you get in Asia that we will see that's coming from the US, but I do think there'll be unique solutions found here in Asia that we wouldn't otherwise see in the US because of the region itself. So let me go through some of the points that I want to raise, and hopefully this comes up. Hopefully you're seeing the key considerations. Now, these are, to be honest, the way that I'm using my own AI agent at the moment and the issues that are coming through. And I broadly see them as technical advancements, and that's a really big topic with data centers themselves. Real estate is another aspect that crosses over with data centers. That isn't my my actual focus within my current role, but I do cross over with the real estate, and it's a critical component in the selection and also the project development side of data centers. The construction and delivery is what I'm focusing on at the moment. Speed to market is key for data centers. The power, which we've briefly mentioned with George, and the regulatory, which is an overall key consideration. Given the difference in the jurisdictions in Asia, and I'll say this again, it's quite different from, of course, the US has a state system, But within Asia, you do get a broad range between, for the lawyers out there, the civil and common law systems themselves, but also within the data center development regulations, and eventually the nuclear regulations themselves. Some jurisdictions do have nuclear support, and some don't. So that's broadly how I see it. It's not, I guess, all of the issues resolved, but how I sort of tackle data centers and how I am tackling them at the moment. So the first consideration is technical advancements. I do think it's worth highlighting how much it's changed. There's 100% of the world's public cloud capacity now sits in the hyperscale facilities. So this AWS, Azure for Microsoft, Alibaba for the Chinese. There's quite a few of these hyperscalers, as we call them, that are just focused on delivery of their own software systems. Cisco's inaugural Global Cloud Index showed cloud traffic had grown 12-fold just between 2010 to 15, and it overtook traditional data center traffic by 2014. The IEA warns AI could more than double data center electricity demand by 2030, eclipsing what Japan's current consumption is right now. So that's a key consideration with data centers themselves. About 20% of the existing data center capacity is already allocated to AI workloads. So this change is coming in quickly, and it's requiring a lot more of the data centers. I think we all know that the annual investment is increased. There's numbers being thrown around of about US 300 billion annually by the hyperscalers, but that's increasing, to be honest, month by month on what's coming next year. So I think cloud's on-demand model, which serves AI quite well, and the algorithms, they really live or die on these data centers. They're the key infrastructure, I think we all know, and the capacity and the demand and the requirements of these data centers is increasing quite dramatically, you know, given these numbers that we're sort of throwing around. Right now, the question has been raised internally, you know, is there a practical substitute for data centers? And right now there isn't, to be honest, there's nothing else. Hence, we're seeing a race between the hyperscalers themselves, and I think also governments will come into the mix, if not now, more in the next year or two. So that really leads to the energy requirements that come from it, which we've spoken about with George. I first came across data centers 15 years ago when I was in private practice. It was small. It was more of a telecommunication center. Part of it was cloud. I have to say, in the 15 years since, and I've come back in the last year or two into the development of data centers, the technical advancements of these centers themselves is unbelievable. It's hard to imagine what they used to look like compared to now. So just as even for myself, understanding the difference in the scale, in 2010, there were about 100 hyperscale sites around the world. There's now in excess of 1,000, and these are just hyperscale facilities, not colos, not edge. This is purely for the larger operators like Microsoft, AWS, and Google. It's also, with that scaling up of data centers, is the IT load capacity as well as increased. So again, 2010, you're looking about 100 terawatt hours. You're looking at about 350 right now, and we're tracking towards at least 620 to 650 by 2030, depending on how much you scale up AI. So AI itself and that component of the data centers has increased 3 to 4 times, and the energy footprint has come with it. Now, there have been efficiency gains through the racks themselves, but the racks, talking in the last sort of requirement of technical advancements, again, 2010, you're looking at racks that were 1 to 3 kilowatts. Right now, 2025, a lot of the racks are between 10 to 12 kilowatts, but they're looking now at development of AI clustered racks, as they're called, between 30 and 50 kilowatts. And I know that there's trials running at 100 kilowatts. So from 2010, you're looking at racks that were 1 kilowatt, roughly. And in the next sort of 5 years, you'll see 100 kilowatt racks. And of course, the requirements of power that come with that increase the same amount. So with such a dramatic rise over the past 15 years, it's hard to imagine that data centers and the growth that comes with them, both from a technical perspective and project development perspective, will only increase more. And I think, as everybody knows, The cloud themselves are taking up a huge proportion of it, but AI itself and the usage is increasing dramatically. And that's just through us talking to each other, but also through the companies themselves. Just switching on, so the technical advancements being quite massive. This is the other key consideration that I see as well. And I do think that this will be a little bit more unique to Asia. Land scarcity is quite an issue. If you look at jurisdictions like Singapore, and they themselves, the government put a moratorium on data centers from 2019 to 2022 due to specifically land constraints. At that point, data centers were also consuming about 7% of Singapore's electricity. So if you look at the trends that are going forward for Singapore, and I do think that this will translate into other Southeast Asian countries, land access and land usage is a key component. You compare that to the US, where you have larger hyperscale facilities that are going up to say 1 or 2 gigawatts. They do have the land size in Colorado, even Canada's looking at large scale. That doesn't translate into what can be adopted in Southeast Asia, especially smaller cities like Singapore, which are landlocked. Looking ahead, I do think, and it's some great points that George has raised, I think nuclear in all of its 3 aspects, and when I say the 3 aspects, the larger scale, obviously, you know, the gigawatt plus, which we've already heard Microsoft is involved with in the US at 3 Mile Island. I do think the mid-size, as we call the SMRs, sort of around 100, and then also the micro down to sort of 10 kilowatts or so, is something that would be translate into an Asian perspective due to the land issues. I will say also the footprint advantage of nuclear do take up a lot less space. We look at renewables as a comparison. I think everyone's looking at net zero through the governments, but also the operators themselves. It's quite difficult to put renewables into these jurisdictions where they're landlocked as well, even with the offshore wind, which costs quite a lot. You don't have that, as George has rightfully said, that dense energy component that nuclear does have. So I do think nuclear is part of the solution for Southeast Asia in the mid to long term anyway. Look, regulatory access is an issue. I think governments are going to have to play a key role in that. I'll talk about that later on, but even within Asia, there is competition within the governments themselves on attracting hyperscale operators to their jurisdiction. But that does lead to the real estate implications as well, and obviously the jurisdiction on who's going to support that and who doesn't want to support that. In Australia, we call it the NIMBYs, not in my area, but I think, and we can understand why it wouldn't be in your area, but there's going to have to be some sort of solution with the governments on how they can work with these landlocked areas and still have a data center. Just flipping ahead, sorry, going ahead. Look, this is another aspect that I'm seeing at the moment, construction and delivery challenges, especially within Asia. There is a general shortage of experienced contractors that have data center experience. I don't think many would have nuclear as well. It's few and far between. If anything, from my experience with nuclear, you do have large consortiums within a country JVing together to deliver these projects. And that'd be something that we'd have to look at quite differently in Asia themselves. So just go back. Look, power security. We already, as George has already mentioned, Southeast Asia's unique power grid is it's heavily dependent on fossil fuel. With the increase of data centers across the region, it will be interesting to see how governments, with the operators themselves, resolve this issue. And look, nuclear, I think, will be part of that solution, as we mentioned, but I think the regulations are going to have to catch up because some jurisdictions already support that and some don't. Just conscious of time. Look, regulatory, as well, George has gone through previously, liability caps will be something that the operators are looking at. You may have seen through India, it's changed its laws on this, and I think that'll more support operators looking at that jurisdiction. And this is where I think you will get competition because Japan, for example, has more of a hands-off basis as you compared to the EU. That will entice operators to look at that jurisdiction and it become a regional hub for hyperscalers. Southeast Asia, look, I think there will be a real shift in Southeast Asia with with nuclear and the ideas of it. I do think it will be quite unique. So what we've seen in the US will be different in Southeast Asia and the adoption of it for a couple of reasons, as we've mentioned, landlocked aspect, but also there's competition between the governments here, whereas the US has one overall regime. Obviously, the states will come into play, but you'll see that Japan, which, for example, has a more hands-off approach and nuclear in play, will start competing with, say, India on its regulation. So I think governments will see this because they will want more data center activity within the region itself. Look, we'll come back to key implications. There is an energy bottleneck. There is no hiding that, especially with the fossil fuels. The technology development that has occurred over the last 15 years, as I've highlighted with data centers, is astronomical, and that will continue to rise. The inputs that will be needed to power all of these data centers, not just for cloud, but for AI, will increase. The landlocked aspect is an issue for Southeast Asia, and it's quite unique as compared to the US. And look, I do think there is an advantage in the first mover. Like I've said, some jurisdictions within Asia have more welcoming regulations. Some are tracking behind, but I do think that they'll be looking left and right to attract more operators to the jurisdiction itself. And I do think that nuclear, with its broad range aspects from the large to the mid to the micro, will offer a solution. I think the issue, though, is it's going to take time. And I think in the meantime, it'll be, what's that going to be filled by? Because the data centers themselves are not going away. The energy requirements are only increasing. So I do think, and as George has mentioned, it's going to require hyperscalers' involvement in whatever capacity that will be, whether it's direct investment or development, but also with the governments themselves. So look, that's a quick run through of my issues, just more to sort of begin the discussion. I'll hand it back to Zaf and George when we go through the questions.
Thanks, Kevin, for your presentation. There's a good overview from what Microsoft is looking at nuclear power and data center, and you drawing parallels from the US and how it needs to be tweaked for the Southeast Asian perspective. So now let's get into a discussion, a panel discussion between yourself, George, and with regards to making nuclear power a reality for Southeast Asian data centers. Of course, we will welcome questions from the audience. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. To kick off this discussion, we'll focus on three critical topics: power supply agreements, regulatory and policy consideration, and lastly, actionable steps to help Southeast Asian operators to adopt nuclear power. So let's start with power supply agreements, or PPAs, which are essential for securing stable energy. Gavin, Microsoft's 20-year PPA with Constellation Energy in the US to restart an 835 megawatt nuclear power plant is groundbreaking. In your opinion, how can Southeast Asian operators structure PPAs for nuclear, especially SMRs, to ensure cost effectiveness and reliability? Gavin, please.
So thanks, Zaf. My first comment is it's really interesting with a company like a Microsoft, and not just Microsoft, but the other operators themselves, traditional tech companies going into what I'm seeing is major projects. That normally doesn't happen because of the structure themselves. They'll have an EPC, they'll be hands off. So they've gone into the project development side, and there's been a lot of lessons learned. I think equally going into these longer term energy arrangements, these tech companies will have to learn as well. And they are learning, and they're having to learn. So I think that in itself has drawn them in because of the requirements. Now, why would you be becoming involved in these energy requirements first, but also de-risking? I mean, George has highlighted it, and I thought it was quite good on the graph itself. Where do you come in on these projects? Now, that's a US model will be a little bit different from Asia, but at some point you've got, and revenue is the beginning. I think it goes without saying these data centers are already leased out to begin with. Microsoft, for example, has Copilot, Azure. It's not an issue with the supply of the revenue coming through. It is there. The issue that you're seeing is the de-risking. So they themselves are going into projects, as like I said, it's been a lesson learned, but they're now going in as an energy player, and that's been, I think, unique, and that's why it was on the news itself. But the question is, at what level do they go in? As George has mentioned, do they go as a direct investor? Do they go in hands off as a virtual PPA or a PPA itself? I think that there's all sorts of solutions, but I do think what happens in Asia will be quite unique in how they do that. So right now, if you look at what happened in the US, there was an opportunity to get in and secure energy, vast amounts of energy. Now, that's not available in Asia. So I think that as a compare, what are the options here? And I think it'll be earlier investment in these projects. But those projects, and I say projects, but energy projects, what do they look like? Will it be an offtake for SMRs when they get going? Will they just purchase that? And I think it will depend on the jurisdiction itself, the regulations, and the de-risking model. So, George, did you have any comments as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. First of all, I agree with everything you said, Gavin. And just to make the point, of course, with the deal in Microsoft in the United States with 3 Mile Island, very unique. And the U.S. is probably one of the few jurisdictions where you have these existing nuclear assets that are perfectly fine, and they were working well. They were just shut down because of market issues. There was not a technology issue, it was not a operability issue or safety issue. It was just the markets just didn't support the existence of that nuclear power plant. That has changed over the years. So you will have a few of those assets that are going to be able to come back. So, 3 Mile Island was one. Palisades is another one that's going to come back to life. But there's a finite number of those. And this is, of course, in the US where you have these assets. As Gavin mentioned, in Asia, we don't. So we have to start looking at things from scratch. You can look at a lot of lessons learned from what has happened in the United States. And as I mentioned before, large reactors could be used doesn't just have to be SMRs. The land issues, of course, is important, but again, when you look at regional collaboration, you're just throwing it out there. It's like having a large reactor program in Malaysia that's going to be able to supply power to Singapore, for instance. That would be, conceptually, commercially, would be a possible solution. It comes back to issues of relations between countries and things like that. But the U.S. side of things is a good way to look at how things have developed. But at the same time, I think in Asia we're going to have bespoke Asia kind of realistic kind of approaches to make sure that they make sense.
Yeah, I think, George, you touched on a very interesting point with regards to the need for us to consider large reactors also, right? Because I think the discussion has been skewed towards too much to SMRs. Only SMRs seems to be the savior for our energy needs. But as in reality, we are still in the demonstration phase for most of the SMR projects. And in the interim, what do we do, right? We have proven technology which has been operating for 60 over years, lots of lessons learned. But the question is, in the case of like small countries like Singapore, large reactors is not an option. Regional cooperation is probably one of the ways to go for ASEAN countries. But what do you think needs to really happen, George, in your opinion, to start the conversation about regional cooperations within ASEAN countries? Should they look from a economic perspective, a GDP perspective? Like at the end of the day, how can the conversation start, George?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think, these are kind of strategic discussions. You have to think about what it is that you want in the end and, to recognize the pros and cons of each approach. I mean, if you have the large reactors, right now, these Gen 3 plus reactors that have been currently built around the world and they're operating, certainly that means less risk, right? Because we know how to build the EPRs, we know how to build the AP1000s, we know how to build the APR 1400s, we know how to build the VVRs. All these things is a huge advancement, right, compared to 20 years ago when all these were just being built. So now we have that, and that de-risks the project. But any project, though, that is being built for the first time in a new country will have first-of-a-kind risks inherent in all that. So that's one part of it. And then you have the SMRs, and you just say, okay, we're going to build X, kind of company. It's going to build a nuclear reactor here in our country. And sometimes you say, okay, where else have they built it? It's like nowhere else. They're discussing in certain places or developing in this country and that country. That's a completely different risk profile. You're actually kind of doing a first of a kind project for the first time that the company has actually built that anywhere in the world. And that has, a lot of risks involved, but also there's potential opportunity in there. If you have that first mover kind of approach where you just say, okay, I'm going to take a lot more risk, but I'm going to get also the benefits of that. You can see yourself as an early investor in a technology. And and again, the other thing, of course, that's important is the issue of looking at this from a fleet perspective. If any country were to build just one nuclear reactor, even if it's an SMR, I would just say the infrastructure that's required, the regulatory support, the societal changes that happen when you develop a nuclear program, in my view, might not be worth it. Nuclear always makes sense when you scale it up and when you have a fleet of that. So if you look at it from that perspective, you just say, okay, well, the first reactor is going to be difficult. We're going to have some cost overruns. We're going to have to establish our supply chain. We're going to have to establish our operational support kind of model. And if you just say, okay, we're going to build one, stop there, I'm not sure if that's the right approach, because you've taken all the risk and all the investment up front and you don't get the benefits. Whereas when you go to the second, third, and fourth one, that's steady state, and then you can start developing. So just to summarize and to answer your question, I think that governments should be thinking about what it is that they want nuclear to do in their countries. What do they want to power with that? And how do they see it from a strategic point of view? Have the end point understood, like this is where we want to be, and then start reverse engineer, go back and start saying, okay, here are the steps that we would take. So we can use existing technology, we can use new technology. I think it's more of a kind of understanding where you want to go, and go back and go back to do it this step by step to reach your goal.
Question for you, Kevin. Countries which need massive energy and want clean energy, but do not want to consider nuclear. Is that even possible?
It's an oxymoron is the word I think of, but I think, look, there may be other ways around it. Lead time's an issue with everything, even with nuclear. It's, if you look at, just think about what I just explained in the 15 years that have happened, how much data centers themselves have changed, what's going to happen the next 5 years, and the energy requirements that come from that. So I think there's only so many times you can dial into the grid and there won't be ESG issues that come with it. There's going to be discussion points from the government and the operator themselves. And you're seeing that there's MOUs being signed in Thailand between Microsoft and the government themselves. They're going to have to look at energy solutions, but large scale energy solutions. And we don't want to go back to coal. We don't want to stay on gas and oil themselves. So where are these large energy solutions going to come from? It's like anything. All these projects require solutions. And I think nuclear needs to be considered as part of it. And that's the reason why the US have done it. The question will be, how does that translate into a solution in Asia with its unique aspects, as we've talked about? But, look at offshore wind, for example, how long that takes to get going. Is that an option for somewhere like Singapore? Maybe, but you're looking at huge costs. Intermittency is an issue as well. You don't have that, as George has said, that dense energy component that you need, and data centers require a huge amount of energy. So I think it's one of those things you need to look at nuclear as a solution, and that's the reason why the US have done that already. It's just there's not, as George says, not many jurisdictions that have this available gigawattage sitting there to be revamped. And maybe there's some in Japan with some of the nuclear facilities have been put off, but and look, next thing you might find Japan has a natural advantage because of that. It's got available nuclear facilities there. Can they be scaled up? It has some regulations there supporting it. It also has newer data center regulations as well. So I'm sure that, and I don't know this, but I'm sure that other jurisdictions are looking at and going, well, we need to start competing. How do we do that? Because with data centers, there are regional hubs as well as global hubs as well, and there will be competition between them. They will be looking left and right.
Agreed.
And just to add to that, Zaf, and Gavin's good points. I think the issue of the abundance of energy required. One thing that kind of like illustrated it to me is having worked on the Baraka program in the UAE, which was 4 nuclear power plants, 4 units for 5,600 megawatts, right? Which is approximately about 25% of the electricity needs of the UAE currently. And recently, I don't know if how many saw when President Trump went to Abu Dhabi and they were talking about a data center that was going to be built with collaboration between Abu Dhabi and the United States, and they were showing the whole thing how it's going to work. And that I read that the energy needs for that are going to be about 6,000 megawatts. So that's another 4 units of nuclear power that's going to come. That's 25% of the current uses of the energy needs of the UAE. I don't know, I mean, unless you have abundant hydro power, I don't know where you find this kind of abundance unless you're willing to start burning fossil fuels again.
Gavin, one question came up, and with regards to how does what would you consider I guess what are your considerations when Microsoft is looking to locate a data center? Like what are the factors? I mean, like obviously energy is one consideration, but it's specifically this person asked, have you considered locating a data center in Indonesia? Indonesia is way ahead of the rest of Southeast Asia on nuclear. Not sure about that point, but what are your considerations, Kevin, for Microsoft with regards to locating data centers? Would you consider a country that's looking at having nuclear power as a country that you would consider?
So first and foremost, that's above my pay grade, but I can say that there's multiple factors in locating a data center. Latency is one issue, regional hub is another aspect, and there's multiples that go into that. And that's sort of where the division of Microsoft development of data center comes up. There's a real estate team that looks into all of that. I more sit with project and power. So we cross over, we see that, we have vision of it, but we don't come into the decision making. But having seen what I've seen, there's multiple factors, and I think most operators go through that. Real estate, latency, but regional hubs as well. There is global hubs as well, where you can transfer the data between, for blockchain, AI, Copilot, Azure, across the jurisdiction, across the globe itself. But you do need regional hubs. So within Asia, there will be hubs. And that's so that you don't sit there and wait for whatever your software requirements are for too long. The second part is, yes, Microsoft's developing in Indonesia. Right now, I'm working on projects. So Indonesia does have data centers specifically for Microsoft services, and it's something that is being looked at. So there are data centers being developed there right now, is the answer.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, David. George, question for you. What are some steps which Southeast Asia operators should take to explore nuclear power, or rather, what should be some of the first steps that Southeast Asian operators should take if they're looking to explore nuclear power, perhaps feasibility studies or talking about partnerships with utilities? What are your views, George?
Yeah, I think the first thing, it's something I mentioned before, is to have a goal. So what is the goal? Why do you want to introduce nuclear power? To what end, right? What is the overall strategic objective? And I think that's going to frame the issues in how do you want to do that. And again, going back to the UAE, I remember the UAE having this strategic analysis and discussion early on, about 2006, 2007, where we said, okay, what is it or what we want to be in about 10, 15 years? What are going to be our energy consumption needs? How do we want to develop? And it slowly became logical to them that nuclear should be part of that discussion. So I think overall understanding that in the world that we live in with the data centers, that could be part of that discussion. Just say, hey, we want to become, like Gavin was talking about, regional hubs. We want to become like the regional hub in Southeast Asia for data centers. We have the real estate, we have all the components, we have the experience, but we want to keep expanding that. It's like, okay, well, the answer is going to be, well, where's your power going to come from? So establishing that kind of framework is important. how that is going to inform their next steps is going to be like this, where you just say, okay, this is what I want to achieve. Well, how do I achieve that? Then you start thinking, it's like, oh, who's going to help me produce that? How do I develop a structure that's going to be meaningful? And one thing that we've seen, for instance, in the United States, as we're looking at regional, smaller, kind of not smaller, but like states that are looking at developing new nuclear with the data centers, and we're starting to see a kind of the emerging of these kind of consortia, which you have the utility, the technology provider, and the off-taker working as a team to develop a bankable structured project that's going to be able to provide the final answer that you want. So I would start with that, for instance. I would put together that team so you can start saying, okay, here's how we're going to work together. And then you say, okay, now we know where we're going to be locating this, where we're going to get the power. And say, okay, nuclear, where we have to start having the feasibility studies about sites. Then you start looking at the technology provider, who can be providing that technology. Do you do a competition? Do you do an intergovernmental agreement with somebody? You get into issues of geopolitics and relationships with other countries. But there are steps that you can take. And most important, though, is with the nuclear part of all this is to start thinking about how are you going to have an operational model, setting up the infrastructure and the investment into developing on your local capabilities to operate a nuclear power plant is going to be very, very important, because it takes a long time to develop that. It doesn't happen overnight to have senior reactor operators that can actually operate safely a nuclear power plant. And even more so with these new designs, right, with the SMRs, where you don't have an actual operating plant. So can't replicate the operating procedures from an existing plant, but these things are going to be developed as you're developing the project. So there's a lot of things that you have to think about. And I think, though, that the way that you attract, though, the data center companies to show them that we have a credible plan for developing power for you, for your needs, but also the nuclear industry, is to have this kind of strategic roadmap that you need to develop as a country. It's just say, here's our objective, here's what the steps are, and here's what we can provide. And that can be, as I said before, government has to be involved. It could be, land concessions. It could be regulatory structures. It could be guarantees, whatever it's going to be. And then say, okay, here's what I can provide. Here's what I need from you in order to get there. And I think once you have this kind of very clear strategic view, you will see how you're going to attract a lot of developers and investors, because they're going to see a clarity of thinking, which sometimes does not exist. You go around the world and you have these kind of general pronouncements from Minister of Energy saying, yes, we want to build nuclear, give us proposals, send us information about your technology. And a lot of the nuclear technology companies have spent years and years sending reams of documents about their technology, and then in the end, where's the project? Who's the customer? So that kind of way is the best way to kind of structure things.
Wonderful, wonderful. Kevin, question to you, Kevin. In your earlier presentation, you talked about 5 key considerations for nuclear power data centers. You mentioned real estate implications. You mentioned construction delivery challenges, power security, energy strategy, technical advancements, and regulatory and policy consideration. Is there a certain level of priority among all these 5 considerations, or do you treat them all equally, Kevin? Or which one do you think is the most important? Or how would you rank them?
Sorry, I just lost my mouse. Sorry. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Saf. Look, from what I've learned going from other projects to this particular project, I guess there isn't a priority as such. It's more, so as I said, it's a grouping of the issues. It's like any project. You have key considerations, and that's how I particularly group them. And to be honest, my own AI agent suggested that, and it's become natural for me to go that way. That's the first way, sort of as a general understanding. The second part is there will be phases. Do you know what I mean? So early on, the real estate is a massive issue before the project delivery team takes over with the power team. So you'll see those issues and what they look like. And that dictates whether, for example, a data center will be owned or leased as well. So, and there are 2 sort of pathways that come. So obviously the pathway that comes to the project delivery team when it's leased is quite different from when Microsoft would be the owner itself. So I see them sort of, real estate is very early on. The technical will sit behind there the whole time. I mean, for those lawyers that are out there, your scope that sits behind the terms and conditions of the contract will be what it's going to be, and that is something you look at, and will always be there. But the power overlays the whole project deal. Is it project financed or not? And then how is your power priced will come into the pricing considerations as well. And that will then dictate whether you choose that particular site or not. Do you know what I mean? So there'll always be 3 or 4 sites that will be looked at on all different aspects, whether it's leased, owned, the power, those sort of things. And then you'll find that one, through all of those considerations, will become the leader, and then there'll be a backup as well to that. So those sort of considerations are overall, and they come into play at different phases where the project is at, either early concept, delivery, and then post-delivery. Hopefully that answers the question.
And just to add to that, again, listening and learning from Gavin now about the issues the data centers face and how they would prioritize that. And I'm thinking exactly how it would be on the nuclear side. Obviously, the nuclear part, if that's going to be the solution, it will have its own considerations, right? And that could impact the timing of the decision for the data centers, the real estate, the location, all these things, because the nuclear part component of that is going to affect the final decision on that. And that's the other thing that I was thinking about, is that if a country were to develop this as a serious kind of part of its demand and just say we want to develop nuclear for data centers very specifically, I would imagine development of a process that takes into account all of these considerations, and you can have like a turnkey nuclear data center process and regulatory structure where you just say, okay, here's where the nuclear part is going to be, here's the data center part, here's the real estate issues, siting issues, things like that. And if you can create this model, I think that would be super attractive for anybody who wants to develop data centers, because you're going to have all the answers up front and you're going to know the process, what it looks like, as opposed to piecemeal just saying, okay, well, on the data center side, we have this. Oh, the nuclear regulatory side, we have to worry about this. You just kind of have to make it up. So I think that could be, to go back to the previous question that you asked me, I said putting together a structure where all that becomes like a model where you put those two industries together could be very attractive.
Wonderful, thank you, George. In view of time, I think let's invite each of our panelists to give some of their final takeaways. George, Kevin, as we've been having quite interesting discussions and 2 very insightful presentations. Perhaps we can end off by Gavin and George, your final thoughts on this topic, nuclear power as a potential solution for the energy demands of data centers in Southeast Asia. I'll start off first with Gavin, your final takeaways.
My final takeaway, so thank you, Zaf, for having me today. It's been really interesting, and if we can look down the track at focusing on other issues, happy to assist. As I've highlighted, the technical advancement of data centers is astronomical. I've worked on other projects, and I can't say that I've seen the change so much, even within the data center itself. A lot of them are built as shells because of the technology itself is changing, not just within the data center, but also the inputs through power, whatever it may be. So the technical advancement is the base of data centers, and the understanding that's required to go forward. That is not going to change. I think we all talk about how we're using AI. If you compare just AI, not the cloud aspect, and if you look at the company aspect of cloud, it's increasing all the time. What you use on SharePoint, Azure, software services, even a small business will go on Oracle or Azure, download everything. AI is now competing with that as well. Hence, these data centers becoming bigger, more technically advanced. I haven't mentioned this before, but even the cooling system within the racks, they're changing from air-based, which from a physics perspective really taps out at a certain point. They're now going to hybrid into eventually, liquid cooling. And these facilities will change, where a lot of the racks will have to sit within or around liquid cooling or a hybrid version of that. So the technical advancement is happening all of the time, and that's because of the demand that is sitting behind all of that. And I think that will continue to develop. So these tech companies are amazing in what they do and they produce. And I think they're going to have to, that will lead to them partnering with, like what George has mentioned, whether it's utilities, governments. We're already seeing that where there's MOUs between governments and large operators, utilities coming in as well, because The reality is these tech companies, Microsoft, Google, they are great at what they do on the technical side, but they're having to learn in project development and now energy as well. And I think there will be investments between all of those disciplines because you can't know everything. Like I've worked with George, previously. He's great in nuclear. I'm working with data centers. We're going to have to cross over, and I think you're going to see that on a much bigger scale for these projects to go ahead. And I don't think it's going to be just hyperscale operators themselves. It will be governments. Governments will see this and say, "Oh, we need data centers themselves for defense, security, those sort of things, not just for the products that the hyperscalers are supporting, through cloud or AI services." So I think all of this demand that's sitting there will drive this collaboration between cross disciplines. That's what I'm seeing, and I think even right now today on this seminar, we're seeing a collaboration between two large industries having to come together to find a solution, and it's going to require that because it's quite unique. It hasn't been, what's happening in the US now is unique, where a large scale operator is looking at revamping an old nuclear facility. What's Asia's solution going to be for that, especially Southeast Asia with its unique aspects?
Thanks, Gavin. And over to you, Josh, your final takeaway.
Yeah, no, just was listening to Gavin, just like such a exactly kind of what I was thinking about, and it really is such a wonderful experience to have this discussion. Although I've known Gavin for some time now, but to be on this panel together and to see how I'm learning from him. Hopefully, he's learning a little bit from me too, and that to see how the two can be put together. And the way that I see it, it's like it's a cycle. I mean, nuclear, the requirement for data centers is abundance of energy, and that's going to keep increasing. I mean, the scale just keeps expanding, exploding, right? It's like a different scale that you even imagine even 5 years ago. So that's going to keep going. It's not going to get smaller. It's just going to keep getting bigger. Nuclear can be a huge solution to that, a huge part of that kind of growth strategy. So nuclear can be the solution for the data center question, and the data centers though can be the answer for nuclear. Nuclear development has been difficult. We've always traditionally had, especially with first of a kind, we've had cost overruns and challenges. And when you have a credible, off-taker that's potentially can be associated with the development of these projects, I think you have a wonderful marriage that can be the catalyst for these projects to happen. So that can be the driving force for new nuclear to develop in these different countries. That's number one point. So the two industries working together solve each other's problem. It's a marriage made in heaven, in my view. Second point is, what Gavin also alluded to is that, okay, you have some developments in the United States, but even in the United States, the structures that we're talking about, especially with new projects, are still being discussed and developed. So any country in Asia that comes up with a solution on putting this all together is going to do something very innovative, something that can be used and exported. It could be a model for other countries around the world, how to develop a proper project, putting those two together. And it's an open playing field at this point. And sometimes, of course, in a country where you don't have the infrastructure, you're actually you're freer to do more things, right? You can develop things from scratch. We saw this in the UAE. It established a new nuclear program without the baggage of having existing regulations or anything like that. And just say, well, we can do something new here. So this can be the next phase where you do something new, nuclear specifically focused for data centers, and establish a regulatory structure and regime that's going to be helpful for that. And that can be something that's really kind of globally first mover and something revolutionary for around the world.
Fantastic. Really some great insights over here. To all our participants, thanks so much for participating. And I think we've got lots of questions, some they overlap. So feel free to drop us your questions even after this webinar has concluded. If possible, we'll get the George and Kevin to answer your questions if possible. But before we end off, a very big thank you to Kevin, George, the G team. I would say, I just realized both of this. So on how to power data centers for nuclear power. We hope Southeast Asia will soon become a reality, nuclear power in the region, and data center could be perhaps one of the impetus to push or nudge governments in Southeast Asia to look at a nuclear power as a clean source of energy. Once again, thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much, George. Thank you very much to all our participants. Have a great day. See you guys. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Zaf.
Zaf.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.